For my research project, I chose the topic Indigenous Schooling in Traditional Languages. So, what I was hoping to do for this project was to find out what the benefits or challenges, or both, would be to teaching Indigenous children their traditional languages in school by utilizing their language throughout teaching their curriculum. So, instead of speaking English, they would be speaking their own native language. So, first, I just have some background information. So, for hundreds of years, Indigenous individuals have been a target of cultural assimilation. The American government has worked to strip Indigenous tribes of their culture, identity, and values, forcing them into a white life. Even though the majority of American Indians today speak English, traditional languages are still an integral part of their cultural identity. Native languages connect individuals to their history, heritage, and traditions. Losing a native language can be seen as losing a vital part of their identity. Then I just have some more research. So the indigenous tend to have less access to education. They have lower quality education. Indigenous education often doesn't incorporate teaching methods that recognize their communities, histories, cultures, pedagogies, or traditional languages. American education has worked to assimilate indigenous peoples into broader society, and substantial evidence supports the benefits of bilingual education. So next I found online the actual indigenous educational goal. So what their goal is for like their all of indigenous who go through schooling. So their goal is education that is well resourced, culturally sensitive, respectful of heritage, and that takes into account history, cultural security, and integrity, encompasses human rights, community, and individual development. So, although this is the goal, this is not really seen in real life. What we kind of see in real life is education policies and systems that have worked to assimilate Indigenous peoples into broader society. Assimilating Indigenous into broader society puts Indigenous at a risk of destroying culture, languages, identity, and rights. Policies and curriculum are typically developed with no Indigenous consent or knowledge. And I kind of think that most education knowledge and curriculum are based around white people and their own history. We see that a lot in black history, and now you see it in indigenous history. So it's just all over. Next, I have the significance of this topic of teaching indigenous folks their own language in education and using that language while you're teaching them. So students connect with their culture, cultural preservation, identity development, academic benefits, intergenerational connection, community empowerment, and cognitive development. So next, I have some history about the indigenous schooling. So in the late 19th century, federally funded schools were created, in which the government took a more direct role. These schools were typically run by the religious. Numerous Native American boarding schools were established across the United States. The most famous was the Carlisle Indian School, built in 1879 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Indian Civilization Act of 1819, along with the Peace Policy of 1869, was an American government goal determined to assimilate American Indians into white culture by creating boarding schools. The Indian boarding schools implemented cultural genocide, removed American Indian and Alaskan Native children from their families and homes, brought mental and emotional suffering, physical illness, decline of indigenous culture and languages, as well as committed crimes to and death of young children. At these boarding schools, like the Carlisle School, students were forcefully stripped of their culture and taught the white man's way. They wore uniforms instead of their own traditional wear, had their hair cut, given new names, and were forbidden to speak their native languages, as well as being forced to adopt Christianity. This next slide, I found this picture that gives a whole list of all the Indian boarding schools that were in the United States. And this shows that there are 523 total Indian boarding schools that operated in the U.S. from 1801 to present day. 408 Indian boarding schools identified by the DOI that received federal support from 1819 to 1969. 105 Indian boarding schools with no known evidence of federal support. 10 Indian boarding schools opened by the Bureau of Indian Education after 1969 or schools that need further research, and 125 of those schools are still open today that were or are considered Indian boarding schools. So what can be done? One thing that can be done is educational materials with sociocultural relevance. What I mean by this is some communities have entered into contracts with the government, designing and implementing projects, educational models that will integrate cultural components and traditions specific to each community into learning. The next thing we could do is inclusive curriculum. What we could do is by providing an intercultural and bilingual education warrants Indigenous peoples to adapt the curriculum to their own cultural context. And lastly, we could incorporate bilingual education. Education in two languages ensures functional and meaningful learning. Simultaneously, learning both languages avoids a future long and complicated process of prioritizing one language over another. Next, I have some benefits to this. So, there would be an increase in metalinguistic awareness. We could learn more academic content, increase in English proficiency, more developed identities and self-esteem, display more respect for tribal elders, exert positive influence in their tribal communities, exhibit constructive classroom behavior and engagement. Next, I have some challenges. Some challenges are devaluation. When an Indigenous language is being taught, it's essential to incorporate worldview, a deep understanding of interconnectedness between living things, land, and spirits. It's important to understand that there are teachers who do not teach children to reflect on the meaning of a word or expression, which causes children to learn their Indigenous language without understanding the feelings intertwined with their language. Next is linguistic variation. Language instruction rarely takes into account the dialect children are exposed to. This can cause confusion where children are putting their Indigenous language to use. Specific dialects can be used in an area and not in one area and not in another, creating a barrier of communication within the same language. Lack of qualified teachers and materials. It can be difficult finding qualified teachers who are fluent in any language or any Indigenous language. There are many endangered Indigenous languages. Problems that can occur are limited teaching materials, cultural sensitivity, historical trauma associated with language suppression, trouble navigating bounds of Indigenous knowledge, and standardized curriculum. And lastly, practical application of language. Difficulty in creating a positive, beneficial atmosphere where children can utilize native language. How do you keep the classroom speaking their language once they leave the classroom? Next, I have an example of a school that incorporates their native language into their educational system. In Oneida, Wisconsin, which is located near Green Bay, Wisconsin, the Oneida tribe came together to form the Oneida Nation school system. The school system is comprised of an immersion schools, elementary, middle, and high schools, along with a few different programs such as Yeti and FACE. The Oneida school system is entirely created for the Oneida tribal members. Language is taught at the schools on the reservation near Green Bay and in two nearby school districts, as well as St. Norbert College and UW Green Bay. The Oneida Nation school system has daily language and culture learning daily and numerous events throughout the year. They really focus on their Indigenous language and their goals and just their tribe as a whole. And a quote that I found from their own personal website is, "We strive toward utilizing the language and cultural concepts on a daily basis to become proficient thinkers, problem solvers, and communicators." And that's my presentation. Thank you.